Alex.
Joined the meeting.
Okay, Joe. Yeah, we're waiting on Ken. Yeah.
Oh, it is?
You make our quorum, Joe, so we'll let you back in.
Yeah. You can't start without me, right?
All right.
Hey, I've never been that important.
Gary,
Yes.
do you know Jim Swift is?
Ken's not here yet. He started the meeting. If he pauses it, we have to restart it and go through the motions again. But we can't convene it without the quorum.
Right.
Either you can keep recording it and,
Yeah, just keep recording.
Okay.
You know.
and then once Ken gets here, then we'll call to order.
Okay. Yeah, don't have to go through all of it again. Joe's coming.
Yes.
Now, the meeting is running because they started it and then they wanna have to stop it again and go through all the stuff, so. As soon as Joe comes back in, we'll convene the meeting. John, you're gonna take the minutes in the meeting?
Yeah, plus everything's being recorded.
Okay, we're good to go? All right, we're gonna convene the meeting, we'll, special meeting on September 24th. And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance. To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Welcome everyone watching at home. Today is item permit application 17-14, Town Center at Shelter Ridge, Bridgeport Avenue / Mill Street / Buddington Road. It is a proposal to create a mixed-use commercial and apartment development involving a commercial subdivision with roadway construction, roadway construction, building construction and grading within a regulated area, outline review area, and discharge of stormwater in regulated area. Public hearing is closed. This meeting is to receive a report from Civil Engineers who conducted a second peer review of the project. In attendance today is the chairman of P&Z, and administrator of P and Z and the assistant administrator of P and Z are also in attendance today. Sorry. Would you like to introduce, well, you can introduce yourself, gentleman from Civil Law.
Good afternoon,
Turn that mic on. I think that one's on.
That's it, okay, thank you. It's Kurt Jones from Civil One. Thanks for inviting us to your meeting, this afternoon to present our, report on the Shelter Ridge, application. We did have a chance to meet with you last month, and since then we've been busy. With me today is, Brian Baker from our office and Mr. Bill Kenny. Brian, did most of the analysis on the engineering side, and Bill took a look at some of the, wetlands issues. We do have a report here. We have 20 copies of the report. Perhaps we could put it on this table here if anybody, would like to get a copy. We have that available. There is a lot of detail in the report, and we structured it into three main sections. The first section of the report has our findings. The second section of the report talks about those findings in detail. And then the third section of the report outlines what we see as recommended additional information to be provided for the application. So we do have a PowerPoint presentation of the, just a summary of the report itself. We can dive into the report as deeply as you would like, or just kind of go through the main issues if you'd like. So as Brian's going along with this presentation, if you'd like to have a little bit more detail, please let us know, and we can give you as much as you'd like.
Okay.
Okay, and so Brian Baker, PE, to talk about the engineering aspects and what he saw when he did the review of the plan.
Okay, thank you. Brian, just one second. I would like to note that because the public hearing is closed, there will be no questions from the audience. Those are regulations, so, but that doesn't prohibit the commissioners from asking any questions that they deem appropriate. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yes, for the record, Brian Baker with Civil One, a licensed engineer in the state of Connecticut, with offices in both Woodbury and Shelton. In addition to the detailed report, the 26-page report that we have a PowerPoint presentation to go through with you, and that'll hit the highlights of the summary of findings and the request for additional information. So I'll hand out some of those. You can follow along with the slides.
Thank you.
Okay, so on the initial slide, you see project overview. Obviously, we've been at this application, chewing on it for a number of years now, so you're familiar with it. 121-acre property on Bridgeport Avenue and Mill Street, broken up into 5 large parcels with mixed-use buildings totaling 762,000 square feet, give or take, mixed use of residential, retail, food service, professional, and medical office. And our peer review reference documents, obviously we looked at your inland wetlands and water courses regulations, the city of Shelton, exhibits 1 through 65 that you had, that were materials submitted during the hearings as they were open. The basis of sort of the DEP guidelines, which are the 2002 Erosion and Sediment Control Guidelines, the 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual, and then the DEP General Permit for discharge of stormwater associated with construction activities that the applicant will have to adhere to. First section with regards to this is a summary of findings with regards to stormwater flows. We believe that the delineation of the drainage areas is substantially correct, and the stormwater flow rate methodology is appropriate. So I know there was questions in the hearings, during the hearings, and from the city engineer that they believe that the watershed from the vernal pool area actually went towards Bridgeport Avenue and not towards Mill Street. The applicant indicated it went towards Mill Street. We do agree with the delineation, and we saw no reference that had been changed over a period of time. So overall, delineation and methodology we felt was appropriate. We did note that the drainage area map was missing some information as far as labeling for clarity, and we also noticed there were discrepancies between the original stormwater report that was submitted and then the addendum that was submitted. There was a change in some curve numbers, which are discrepancies that would have to be rectified. We also noticed that the detention/infiltration beds, that was a point of contention during the... Yep.
The discrepancies, were they severe discrepancies?
They could be, yes. I mean, there was a curve number that in the original set of applications was at 68, and then in the addendum was dropped down to 64. You know, the curve number represents how much runoff is coming off of the property, right? So if you're dropping it down from 68 to 64, but nothing in the plan has changed, why is that different? And how does that affect your flow numbers? The detention infiltration beds that they proposed to deal with the stormwater, they did propose some very small outlets, in some cases 1 inch, which would be prone to clogging, so that could be problematic.
Sorry to keep it.
Yep.
So you say it's 1 inch, but did you come up with any recommendations as to what should be the standard?
Yeah, we could get into that with our summary of recommendations, but in general, what we've seen in our standard practice is nothing smaller than 3 inches as far as an opening for outlets. And basically what typically happens if you have a system that only works, if it can only work with a 1 inch outlet, in order to get the 3 inch outlet to work, you need more infiltrators, you need a larger bed for that storage. And basically in this section we'll get into, these are the requirements in the 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual. So this is our guideline for when we're designing a stormwater system to provide proper treatment. The first thing in stormwater treatment is the water quality volume. The water quality volume was not properly treated in accordance with the guidelines in 2004 Stormwater Quality Manual with this application. There's information on the subsurface soils and the infiltration capacity of the soils, and the groundwater and ledge were not submitted as part of the application, and that's a requirement as part of the guidelines of the water quality volume. Secondly, so there's really 3 big things in the Stormwater Quality Manual. You have the water quality volume treatment. Secondly, you have groundwater recharge volume, which is recharging the groundwater to provide long-term water to the wetlands to maintain pre-development conditions. There were no calculations provided for groundwater recharge volume with the application. The third is stream channel protection criteria. This is basically you're supposed to take the 2-year post-development storm and knock it down to the 1-year pre-development storm in order to prevent long-term erosion in stream channels. Now, you either have to meet it, or you have to show that because of where you lie in the watershed, that it's not required. The applicant did neither of those with the application. Next section, we talk about conveyance and outlet protection. So this deals with getting into a little more of the engineering of the storm drainage pipes itself. The storm drainage conveyance calculations were incomplete for swales, steep segments of pipe, and outlet protection. There were no calculations for outlet protection provided. The grading and drainage plans were incomplete with regards to pipe labels, drainage profiles, and other features. With regards to the stormwater infiltration beds, some of the installation was at depth in excess of what the manufacturer recommends. Additionally, there was question about long-term inspection and maintenance of the infiltration beds. And the applicant did not provide enough information with the application to prove that there was adequate long-term maintenance of the beds in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations. With regards to erosion and sediment control, in my review, our review of the project, did not meet the guidelines outlined in the 2002 guidelines, nor the DEP requirements for the stormwater general permit. Proper construction phasing plan was not submitted, nor supporting calculation for the sizing of the erosion control features. Not submitted. For this section, we're going to get a little bit more about the wetlands itself, which we had Bill Kenny from William Kennedy Associates join our team and look at the wetlands impacts, wetlands regulated areas, vernal pools, that type of thing. So the next few slides, Bill will highlight for you.
Good afternoon. I am Bill Kenny, the principal of William Kenny Associates in Fairfield. I'm a professional wetland scientist, soil scientist, and landscape architect, and I've been working in the wetland and watercourse review and development area for more than 25 years in southern Connecticut. So, just a quick overall summary with regard to wetlands and watercourses and their impacts. And what we really focused on was, were the regulated areas fully documented? Because if you're going to have impacts, you need to know first, where are those areas? And then second, were the regulated activities fully documented? And then and then you also need to determine, if you have activities that are regulated, are there potential for impacts fully documented? So we found that within those three areas that the documentation was incomplete in our opinion. In particular, if you start with mapping of the regulated areas, it appears that the mapping of wetlands and watercourses on site are substantially complete from what we could see. We did not, although we do wetland mapping on a regular basis, we didn't go out and check every lineal foot of the boundary, but it appears to be complete and appropriate. What seems to be missing is areas that are off-site, and the project includes disturbance and improvements along Bridgeport Avenue and along Mill Street. And it appears that all of the wetlands and watercourses that might be present on those off-site areas have not been fully documented. So then that leads you to then that the regulated activities aren't fully documented because some of those areas aren't shown. And then also that automatically you're not sure what the potential for impacts are if you don't know where those regulated areas are and the regulated activities. Another thing to note with regard to areas proposed activities that are on different properties. When you submit the application, you have to identify what properties are involved with the application. On the application form, it identifies, from what I can see, just the development site itself, and not the areas that are off-site that development site. And you need to identify the property and the ownership, and that doesn't seem to be included in the application form. With regard to the vernal pool impacts, decision about how might a project adversely affect the wetland. And particularly according to state statutes, you're looking at the physical conditions of that well. And the state statutes don't allow for you to deny something, for example, where you affect a salamander in the upland, but you can't deny it simply because you're affecting that particular species. It has to be tied back to how does that species affect the physical conditions of the wetland. And so it is important, what the application is missing, and your other independent consultant concluded, was that there wasn't sufficient information to determine how much of an effect on the vernal pool species population and density. Are you going to wipe out an entire species by this development, or are you going to take a population that is at 100 individuals down to 10 individuals? And it just appears that wasn't fully addressed. We didn't find information that showed that was fully addressed. And it might be that you're dropping that population quantity and it doesn't then have an impact on the physical nature of the wetland, but no conclusions were drawn with regard to that. Also, there were, this is more minor in nature, but there were some proposals to install some wildlife barriers to control the movement of these animals that use the vernal pools, whether it be wood frogs or spotted salamanders or even the spotted turtles. And the application was, although they identified some locations for these wildlife barriers, they didn't provide construction details and maintenance information about these. So once you put them in, what's going to ensure that they're going to be maintained? And in addition, in some locations, they're located within utility easements. The significant easement that bisects the site, and there was not any information that there was permission for that to occur in the easement. Is that going to get damaged when the utility company is doing work within the easement and so forth? And your obligate, what's considered obligate of those species are the wood frogs and spotted salamanders, which were discussed in the application. Spotted turtles isn't necessarily a obligate species, but it is a species that uses the wetland, that vernal pool habitat that you find on the site. It could use that, and so there was a lack of information about how that population, what's the scope of the population of the turtle on the property, and how would the development affect that population, and how would that affect the physical conditions of the wetland. So there's mitigation measures that are proposed to offset adverse impacts that have been identified. And an area of new wetland was proposed in the northern portion of the property. And what we have found is that when you're looking at creating a new wetland, and then you're going to use that to mitigate for the loss of wetland habitat or loss of watercourse habitat, there's two major things that we're looking at. One, is it going to be wet? Are you going to have adequate water there to ensure that it's going to be a wetland? Or are you just manipulating the land and it's going to end up being an upland, and you're really not getting that habitat that you're being promised? So we found that there wasn't adequate information to ensure that you're going to get a wetland habitat at the end of the day. So that's just by its placement within the landscape, its shape, how it's being graded to ensure that it's going to hold a certain amount of water for a certain amount of time throughout the growing season to then meet the definition of what's a wetland as defined by the state gonna be properly constructed? And 3, afterwards, is it gonna be maintained, so that, invasive vegetation doesn't take over that? And it was, on the third piece, it was also lacking, sufficient information to ensure that the invasive vegetation was not, overrun the area. And the period that is needed for that area, for the vegetation you're planting, you need 3 to 5 years for that, to become established, so that it can fend for itself. And we found that the information for maintaining that area during that period was not, adequate. There is a crossing of the, main wetland and water course that drains down to the central portion of the property, the road crossing, and we found that there was, when you install that crossing, you wanna do it in a way that if there's water flowing through there, if you don't have a plan to deal with the water, then you end up with, sediment-loaded water, sediment getting in the water from your construction activities and then flowing downstream and impacting wetlands and water courses downstream. So it's pretty, easy thing to deal with from an engineering standpoint, but the information wasn't, included in the documentation, so we think there's a potential for additional impacts downstream, unless you provide that information with the documentation. I think another, big item has to do with altering of the amount of earthwork that's occurring on the property, the amount of cut in the land, lowering and raising of land in different areas, and what effect that's gonna have on the, change in the hydrologic conditions of the different wetlands on the site. And information was lacking to, adequately address whether or not, different areas, in particular, the concern is, are you gonna drain a wetland? Are you gonna take a wetland area that is currently receiving a certain amount of groundwater and surface water flow, and by changing the land, up gradient of this area, are you going to divert water away from the area and dry it up? And so it becomes what's considered an indirect impact. You're not actually filling in the wetland to eliminate it, but by removing water from that wetland, you eliminate it as a wetland area. And we found that there are several areas where some information is missing to document with certainty that the areas would not be drained. So we're concerned those areas would be drained, and that would be an additional area of wetland.
I'll jump back in and give Brian Baker, for the record. Something that we identified, it wasn't called out during the, hearing minutes, was that there is, significant activity and impacts within the CLMP and the Iroquois, utility easements. There's significant fill, associated with the crossings of the easement, which will effectively cut off maintenance access, for the utility companies. And there should be some evidence provided that utility companies, agree with the plans or find that acceptable. We've run into that before with the multiple applications where you're crossing a utility area, you either have to match existing grade or come close to it, or provide alternate access for them to get in and maintain, their easement area. And some areas they have, some significant fill, in that area, which effectively cuts off, the maintenance access.
Right. With the authority as public service companies by these two utility entities, if they needed to go in and do something and work was proposed within their rights of way as far as mitigation of wetlands or this wetland is gonna stay unaltered. But then now they have to go in under their public, utility, service rights. Do they have the ability to say, oh, we gotta go in, we gotta take care of this power line, we gotta take care of this gas line?
In my experience, yes, you know, the utilities requirements, sort of trumps, all others, to some degree. We've seen when they go through under, power lines and clear cut and create their new access drives, and, they do a good job typically of, they do flag the wetlands and try to mitigate impacts, but if they need to impact the wetland area, they will get through there, and that's, I think it's in part of our recommendations here, but the applicant does, put their wetland mitigation area within that easement area. So what approach you have at the utility company, and it basically is right over where the existing dirt drive is, through that utility easement area. So I don't see how a utility company, in my experience, would approve creation of a wetland over, where their access drive is. Again, it didn't seem like there was any correspondence there. Utility companies are typically good to work with, and they'll work with you, but, obviously they need to, be sure that they're able to access, maintain, and take care of the utilities.
So what you're really saying is the utility has to approve, anything that's going on within, as we know, within their, easement.
Absolutely, and I think there needs to be some testimony, like as Bill had mentioned, the wildlife barrier is right in the easement. So how is that being constructed? When CLMP needs to, or Iroquois needs to go in and brush hog that easement to clear it out, are they gonna wipe this barrier out? What is this barrier? It's gonna be in their agreement that, if it's a stone wall, we're gonna leave it, but there needs to be some correspondence to ensure that the wildlife barriers and the mitigation area as shown, will be taken care of in perpetuity.
So in your opinion, would that have to be, a deeded change or clarification?
There would, at a minimum, I would think for your commission, there would have to be something that gives you enough of a level of comfort to say, okay, we believe that this can be done. Utility companies, it's correspondence that says, we've reviewed the plans and we concur that this is not an issue as far as maintenance for us, and that we will, we won't do any activity in the wetlands mitigation area as utility company, something like that, or, I don't know if you would get into the specifics of the easement language, whether that should include, okay, your easement now includes a wildlife barrier, which it didn't before. I would say at a minimum, you need to have some correspondence to show that the utility companies would accept the filling, wildlife barriers, and the mitigation area, as shown. And then with regards to feasible and prudent alternatives, in my review of the application, I did not see where feasible and prudent alternatives were submitted to the commission. If you look at the original set of plans that was submitted, next to the revised set of plans, they're substantially the same. It's very difficult to tell the difference between the two, other than that they did add a few things, some additional wildlife barrier, and they added a, condition of wetlands approval with 12 or so notes of things that they would do, subject to a wetlands approval. But in our opinion, that is not a feasible and prudent alternative that was provided. It basically provided you with a set of plans, and made minor revisions to them.
So, yeah, mention that that's the end of the summary.
Yeah, so that's the end of the summary, and we kind of dabbled into recommendations a little in our discussion here, but we'll go through basically, hit the same sections. And these are our recommendations for, additional information or modifications to the plan, that we believe would be necessary. With regards to stormwater flows, mentioned there are discrepancies in the curve number calculations, should be justified or corrected. To the vernal pool and this is, we think that there is concerns about the stormwater flows to Mill Street, right? The vernal pool actually acts as a detention basin, so if you want to get a little more accurate flow data for what's actually going towards Mill Street, that should be modeled as a detention basin. Just give you a little more accurate information on what those flows are, and that would help you both pre and post to understand what those flows are going towards Mill Street. Drainage area mapping should show clearer labels and an accurate time and concentration flow paths for you and your consultant's review. Inlets and outlets of the detention basins should be located on opposite ends of its infiltration beds. It's just the sort of standard engineering design. If you have an inlet, you like to put the outlet on the other side so the stormwater has to flow through the entire system versus short-circuiting and getting from the inlet to outlet more quickly. Not the end of the world, but that is standard engineering practice to put your inlets and outlets on opposite ends of whether they be basins or infiltration beds. Outlet sizing for the opening should be 3 inches at a minimum, in our opinion. We recommend an additional pre- and post-development flow analysis point where wetlands H leaves the property. So that's along Bridgeport Avenue. Wetlands H leaves the property, goes onto private property, and then ultimately down to Bridgeport Avenue. We're concerned about the potential for increased flows at that particular point, so that should be analyzed. We recommend relocating the outlet for the infiltration.
So what you're saying, Brian, is that wasn't done to your satisfaction?
It wasn't done, it wasn't identified during the hearing, and it wasn't done. So it wasn't called out, nobody noticed at that point that, hey, this wetland goes across private property here before it gets to Bridgeport Avenue, and it wasn't identified as another drainage design point.
Right, so we don't know the flow to that
We
area.
don't know the flow to that area. We recommend relocating out the outlet for infiltration bed A3A. So that's the infiltration bed that's up near the top of the site where the drainage divide is between what goes to the vernal pool and what heads towards Bridgeport Avenue. The outlet's right near the high point. That should be slid down further down because obviously right near the high point of the drainage divide, you get very little water drainage right now, so you should put your outlet pipe there. In particular, if you slide it down further down the water course, then your pre and post flows at that particular minute point are going to be closer to the same. So that's just a minor recommendation, but it should be, outlet should be relocated. And then overall flows to the west must not exceed pre-development flows. So this was towards Mill Street, and obviously that's a point of concern. Because of the discrepancies in the runoff curve numbers, I agree with the methodology, I agree with the way they delineated the drainage areas, but because of discrepancies in those curve numbers, I cannot say that they are providing zero increase in stormwater flow towards Mill Street.
So it's not a reliable.
There's a discrepancy that needs to be addressed. The curve number went from 68 to 64, so it got lowered, which means lower flows post-development. There's nothing in the record, and nothing changed as far as the delineation of the drainage area between the two reports. Just the number changed, and I don't know why that number changed.
I'm just amazed, there was no justification as why it went from 64 to 68.
No, there was nothing explained as to, and if going from one report to the addendum also included, hey, we changed this drainage delineation and that's why it changed, or we cut back the building, or we changed something then it would be logical. I could see nothing in the record as to what changed physically with the plan that would justify changing the curve number. So that deals with your flow rates, is what we're talking about now. We talked about stormwater treatment. Again, the focus of the 2004 guidelines. If you're gonna propose treating your water quality volume with underground infiltration units, you need to do soil testing and infiltration tests in those areas to determine if you got adequate separation to ledge and groundwater. Those were not included in the application package. Cross sections through the proposed infiltration beds should be provided so you can see how deep they are, where ledge and groundwater are in those infiltration bed areas. We recommend the installation of separator rows in the infiltration beds. This gets into the potential for long-term maintenance of the infiltration beds. The applicant had submitted, basically, when the issue of long-term maintenance of the beds came up during the hearing, they added a note to the detail for the infiltration beds that said, we'll install an inspection port every 100 feet on center. If you go to the manufacturer's information for Cultec units, the inspection ports are 6-inch PVC pipes. They're meant for inspection really only and not maintenance. You can envision you're putting a 6-inch pipe every 100 feet on an infiltrator bed that's 8 feet below the ground. There's no potential for maintenance there. You can inspect it, but you can't maintain it. These isolator rows, which is what the manufacturer provides, it's not something that's impossible. It's basically one row where the inlet is wrapped in filter fabric, and you provide larger manholes for maintenance and vacuuming of that separator row, and that ensures that you've got long-term capacity and won't have long-term sedimentation of the beds. And, you know, again, as part of our recommendations, we do recommend that a revised storm drainage system design adhering to the 2004 stormwater guidelines should be submitted. Stormwater volume, again, revised storm drainage system that includes calculations for both water quality volume and groundwater recharge volume should be submitted. Steam stream channel protection criterion, revised storm drainage system design that includes the stormwater protection criterion should be submitted, or justification that they are low enough in the watershed and have a small enough percentage of the watershed that they don't have to provide it. You have to either should do one or the other. Either you're required to provide it, or you don't, and you show the calculations why you don't need to provide it. Neither of those information was included in the application. Conveyance and outlet protection, so conveyance meaning pipes and swales, outlet protection meaning your riprap at the end of a pipe for erosion control. This is typically standard engineering things and calculations that, you know, we would submit as part of any detailed site plan package. You should have swale capacity calculations, hydraulic grade line calculations, specifically for steep sections of pipe. There's a section of pipe going down towards Bridgeport Avenue that's in excess of 30% slope, and another section that goes, the one that goes down the hill towards Mill Street is in excess of 40%. So a hydraulic grade line calculation is warranted for them to make sure that no water is going to stay in that pipe when it comes down and hits the drainage manhole. Should be, again, standard engineering package for review and construction. Should have driveway and drainage profiles with stationing and label for all the drainage structures and pipes. And there should be some additional labels on the retaining walls to show where a wall is, but as far as height of the wall, you know, elevation at the top and the bottom are not included in the plan set. Just provide for easier evaluation and ultimately construction. As far as installation and maintenance of the stormwater beds, we touched on this a little bit just a moment ago. Should be a long-term maintenance plan provided for those. As the application is proposed, those are your only measure for detention and long-term treatment of stormwater, other than the oil grit separators that were provided. Inspection ports should be redesigned to provide, greater inspection and maintenance capacity. The layout of those infiltrator beds should be minimized, or should be moved around to minimize the depth of cover over them, in accordance with both the manufacturer's recommendation, and obviously, if you ever have to maintain or replace any of these units, the less fill over the top of them, the better. And again, yes, information on separator rows, if included, should be provided as part of the application. With regards to erosion sediment control, we recommended detailed phasing and erosion control plan should be prepared, and earthwork quantities for those individual phases should be provided. There's some erroneous labels on the construction phases. Basically, all of the different parcels were labeled parcel A construction sequence, so it's minor, but you should parcel A, B, C, D, and E. The detailed information for the erosion control measures should be submitted, and that includes calculations for the sizing of the erosion control measures. They show a temporary sediment basin, but there's no calculations for the sizing of that basin to prove that it's adequate for the drainage area that it's going to receive. To give you an idea, and reading through the testimony, the applicant said, we have a sequence, it's parcel A, B, C, D, and E. Well, you look at parcel A, it's 16 acres in size. The DEP threshold, they want you to get into as close to 5 acres as possible. Number one. Number two, parcel A requires 236,000 yards of fill. You're obviously going to have to get into parcel B, D, or E to get that material, so you're going to have other areas open at the same time. So there needs to be a construction sequence that works with the erosion or the earthwork quantities to show that, okay, under phase one, we're going to take this material from here, move it to here. And it may not correspond exactly with your parcel A, B, C, D, and E. You may be in part of parcel A and part of parcel B at the same time. But based on the way it's laid out, you can't construct it and be in conformance with the erosion control guidelines. Just move on through these bills. All right. Yeah, I'll do it. So these, and if there's any additional detailed question, these are sort of bill section, but I'll just run through them with you. We work together on it. Bill mentioned a mapping of the off-site wetlands and water courses within the construction area should be included. The impacts to off-site wetlands and water courses should be included with the application. Any activity regarding road widening and drainage improvements within the public right-of-way should be added to the plans, so we can assess the impacts of those. The direct wetland impact footprint should be clarified. There were two different numbers. It was minor, but they were on the application. It called for 4,000 something square feet, and then another document it was slightly different. So it's going to be consistent with whatever you're approving. If you choose to approve it, if you're approving the exact accurate amount of wetlands disturbance. And some correspondence should be submitted demonstrating in the general acceptance of the public improvements as shown on Bridgeport Avenue by the DOT. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the easement activity. You don't need to have a final approval of full detailed plans, but there should be some documentation provided, we believe, in the record that the plans as submitted and the improvements, the widening of Bridgeport Avenue, at least in concept, DOT agrees with that. With regards to vernal pool impacts, calculations and discussion regarding the total area of existing and proposed development within the 100-foot to 750-foot critical terrestrial habitat should be submitted. Disturbance migration patterns, for the, species within the vernal pool, should be analyzed and discussed. Assessment of the migration pattern should be provided. If you review the record, the discussion from Environmental Land Services, from ELS, that was the consultants, wetlands applicant, they had pointed to a memo from a conservation officer, I believe, that said she had witnessed migration of amphibians to the west across one of the adjacent roadways, and they sort of relied on that as, well, that's the mitigation pattern, because that's where they've seen the amphibians going. Well, they're only gonna see, you're only gonna see the amphibians crossing the road, unless you go out there and, and actually watch what's going on in the woods. You don't know if they're headed to the east. We know they're headed, some of them are headed to the west, because they're crossing the road and getting on over, so. And then, detailed drawing notes and utility agreements for the proposed wildlife barrier should be submitted. Again, if we're gonna say that this wildlife barrier is gonna be what protects this vernal pool long term, we need to know that that's acceptable to the, utility companies, and it will be in place long term. Spotted turtle considerations. Additional information regarding wildlife sweeps should be provided. Documentation of the potential effect of the development on the spotted turtle should be provided, and a detailed turtle protection program should be provided. There was discussion of it in the hearings, and they said, yeah, we'll include it on the plans, but again, the plan should include, in our opinion, if you're going to approve a set of plans, it should include all of the necessary details and data. With regards to wetlands mitigation and the landscaping plan, Bill hit that pretty good. There's discussion of it in the record, and there's notes, like a section of notes that was added to the first, page of the plan that says, yeah, we'll provide it. Well, the commission adequately assessed the landscaping plan, the mitigation plan, its long-term viability. Those notes and details, cross-sections, soil testing should be included as part of the plan set, in our opinion. And it would include an invasive species control plan, should also be included. For the wetlands crossings, again, the water handling and dewatering details should be provided, follow best management practices. Information as far as wetlands and water courses drainage conditions, there should be additional information provided regarding modifications of drainage flow rates and patterns, and potential volumes of water to different wetland areas. Specifically, wetlands G is an outlet, was proposed as an outlet for some of the stormwater. That's going to get a significantly amount more water than it gets currently. Currently, there's just a narrow band of overland flow that gets to it now. The outlet of one of the large infiltration basins will get there to that. So some assessment of that wetland's ability or capability to handle the additional water should be provided, as well as an analysis of the proposed rock excavation and its effect on the watershed and wetland areas. So some of that information, that's geotechnical information, that when you're dealing with this much excavation, grading, blasting, certainly there should be additional geotechnical and potentially hydrogeological information provided to ensure that those wetlands are going to be protected. Again, just reiterating the fact that the work in the easement areas, should be some documentation from the easement companies that they agree with this, and then cross-sections of cuts and fills through those easement areas should be provided. In one area, we've got 10 to 12 feet of fill for the wetlands crossing that's underneath wires. Now, you're filling 10 to 12 feet of material there. You have to actually do an analysis of typically the power companies require an analysis showing that the wires in the summer, when they're at their lowest, that you have adequate clearance to the wires, and if you're filling, and now you're gonna get 10 to 12 feet closer, then you can prove that you've got adequate clearance there, and it's not gonna impact them, as well as their ability to access and maintain the utilities. With regards to, again, feasible and prudent alternatives, we believe a feasible and prudent alternative study should be provided to the commission that meets the recommendations outlined in the reference documents. We don't feel that that was provided. Again, the findings and recommendations outlined in our peer review are intended to assist you in making a determination on the application. The decision criteria for an approval application is obviously, you're well aware, outlined in your sections 10.2 and 10.3 of your recommendations. What we did is, there was a lot of information, obviously, provided in all those 65 exhibits and the 8 public hearing testimonies, so we tried to boil it down the best we could. Having said that, we probably scratched the surface of some of the items, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I know there's a lot there, but there's a lot in the record.
John, you have some? Do you have any questions? Not yet. Not at this time. Just one question. Concerning the geotechnical report, now I know the applicant had made a statement at one of the hearings that they had hired a geotechnical firm, right, John? I think, right? And that,
Either did or they were
in the process of doing it, right? And because then one of the questions was where the infiltrators were being placed. And because they had made some design changes, they said they weren't exactly sure 100% where those infiltrators would be located. And that then that firm would then do that test there, when they determined where they were gonna place the infiltrators. But yet nowhere in any of the documents that I have or read or, gone over 1,000 times since then, have I found any mention of any company or anything to do with a geotechnical firm. I mean, I would think that if you're gonna, make a statement to the commission saying that, you're going to hire this firm, or, and it was almost, the way I took it was that they did hire this firm, but they were waiting to find out where they wanted them. But I was concerned that, well, who are they hiring? If you're gonna say, so-and-so is gonna do the testing, is going to do all of this, I would like to know who that firm would be. And so you didn't find any of that information either?
In the last, if you read the minutes of the last hearing, basically it sounded like they had, I believe they had discussions with GZA, and there was also in an earlier hearing, Mr. Swift had indicated, yeah, I could hire GZA and they could give you some information, but we don't feel that we need to provide that because we're not relying on infiltration. And I think you got towards the last hearing and they realized that, the infiltration is an important part. If you're gonna say you're holding a water quality volume, you gotta provide the infiltration. So my recollection of the testimony in the last hearing was that they said, yeah, as part of the condition of approval, we would hire a geotechnical firm. We've had discussions with GZA, and we would make sure that they do whatever testing is necessary and provide whatever information is necessary to prove that the infiltration could occur, was my recollection. There was no data provided, no testing provided, simply, we'll do it after the fact. And again, typically, when we submit a set of plans, if we're gonna rely on the infiltration, that's part of the submittal package, that data. Because if they are putting one of those large beds of infiltrators in an area where groundwater, is at 6 feet, and they're putting these 12 feet deep, it doesn't matter what kind of soils you have. If there's groundwater in there, all that infiltrator unit is gonna do is intercept the groundwater and bring it to daylight, which is kind of the opposite effect of what you want with a groundwater recharge system. So, the additional analysis, data testing, certainly it can be done, and may need to move infiltrators around, maybe need to be significant redesign in some of the locations, but the information was not submitted.
Right, and that, that's the point that I think I'm thinking about, is that, okay, you have this whole project all laid out, this is where your infiltrators are gonna be placed, then you hire this firm and you find out, guess what? It doesn't work. Now what are your options at that point? You've opened up this site, you've got all these things opened up, you've got erosion, and all these things going on, and now you can't continue your project because basically you didn't do your homework. In a sense, you're building on a bad, design.
Yeah, we're here to review the record and to tell you what we would have done as professional engineers, and that's certainly, in my opinion, data that's critical to the design as it is proposed. You need to know where the groundwater and ledge is, whether you're gonna be in it or above it, and if you're gonna be in it or in the groundwater or in the ledge, then you need to, provide some sort of geotechnical or hydrogeological analysis to say, okay, yeah, we're gonna be intercepting a groundwater table in this area, but over here, we're providing so much more infiltration, it's gonna make up for it, kind of thing that data was not provided.
John, good.
In the experience of your firm, working across the board, both sides of a table for municipalities, applicants, when it comes to the feasible and prudent alternatives test, in your experience, have you seen feasible and prudent alternatives including, say, shifting of buildings or consolidating of buildings or reduction in order to affect the positive protections that might be envisioned for some particular important resources?
Certainly. If there are certain areas of a proposal that are sticking points, that are concern for potential impacts, feasible and prudent alternatives, typically, when I see a feasible and prudent alternative, you look at the overall site plan and then you see the feasible and prudent alternative, you can tell that there's modifications that have been made. Again, in the last hearing of testimony, I believe the applicant testified that they would be amenable to moving one of the buildings back to provide a 200-foot envelope from the vernal pool instead of 100-foot. That's a good start towards a proven feasible alternative. However, in 2 years of hearings and testimony, that revision was never made. It was the last hearing they said, sure, we could do that as a condition of approval. But without seeing that overall plan and impact, it's difficult to assess. Obviously, it's better, right? From a wetland potential vernal pool impact. However, as Bill had mentioned, a more detailed study of the pool itself was done and the clearing limits that really justified the clearing up to 100 foot without any impact to the wetlands. Maybe that could be provided, but there's just more information that should be provided on the vernal pool itself.
Thank you. I think personally you did a great job looking at all the 2 years of testimony and putting it into a readable and understandable format. I'm sure the commission thanks you for that. But in looking at this, you cited 18 specific areas. Out of that 18 areas, you really came up with 54 recommendations that I would call, and I'm going to ask you, would you call them major recommendations for the most part, that seem to be critical to the protection of not only the wetlands, but also of the drainage calculations that's flowing to Mill Street, that we would have to go over in order to reach a decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's really up to the commission to look at those recommendations, compare them to what the criteria is that you have to go by to make your decision. Yes, there's a lot of items there, a lot of recommendations that we felt we had to make, and we obviously, Kurt and I come into this from the development side. You know, if we went in and reviewed this and there was one recommendation to make, we would have given you one. There was a number of shortcomings in the data that was provided, with a project that is of this scope, that we feel additional information is really needed to assess it.
Just want to add, just to address Ken's comment a little bit, it's Kurt Jones. Our intent in making so many recommendations is to hopefully provide a roadmap for the applicant to say, listen, guys, here's what we think is a pretty complete list, and hopefully if you're able to do all of these, then, you know, you're in a position where the commission's going to feel good about approving it. So it's really kind of intended as a roadmap to help him move the application along.
Mr. Chairman, just two more points. One, I think we'd like to invite the consultants back after we read this, for specific questions in different areas that you could probably help and give us some guidance to. The other thing, and I guess it's a fault of ours as a commission, is that we forgot to invite, or don't have the city engineer here, who's an integral part of everything that's going to happen up there with the wetlands and the drainage and the flow rates and capacity. So we may have to ask the consultants to at least brief and go over the report with our engineer. I don't know how everybody else feels, but those are the guys. That's it.
All right, you good? Good, no more questions? Fred, anything? No? Good.
So I guess John or myself or Fran will contact you for the follow-up.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
We're going to, after, go ahead, John. We're gonna, again, just reiterating Commissioner Nappy's comments. I think it was a very, very good report. Looking forward to reading this more than once. We're going to also have to set another date for, meeting after we have a chance to go over and review this, right? We have to get the stuff that the other commissioners.
Yeah, maybe the Corporation Council has a date that we have to have it or ask for an extension.
I think what you ought to do is schedule your next meeting. We'll ask for the extension. I don't think that the applicant is going to refuse.
John, if we could, if you could check the availability, next week, fine with everybody?
Next week?
Next week? No? Okay, next week? Yeah. All right, maybe, same date, same time?
That's fine.
All right, John, you can check on the availability of the room here.
Next Thursday?
Next Thursday, same time. All right, and, we'll look.
Chairman, you ought to, when you notice the meeting, put a dash and put workshop. The public is invited to any public meeting that's had, but if you put the word workshop, they'll know that there's no public input. Some people may come thinking they can talk.
Okay.
It's really an observation meeting.
Okay. John, you got that noted?
Yeah.
Okay,
The motion to adjourn.
motion's been made to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Meeting adjourned.